Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and welcome to day 3 of HYLA's Hunger Relief Awareness Week. So far this week, we've talked to food nonprofits about the work they've been doing since the pandemic hit and how the pandemic has impacted operational and volunteer needs. And then yesterday, we had a really fun virtual community service event where we decorated brown lunch bags, which will be donated to Kids Meals Inc. later this weekend. And tonight, what we wanted to do is kind of shift the focus of the week to speak more about how food insecurity issues manifest within the public policy space, the legislative space, how they interact, food insecurity needs intersect under sort of certain sociological, anthropological spaces as well. And we're very lucky to have Ms. Ramya Ravishankar with us tonight, who's corporate counsel for Bowery Farming. She's become a new friend over the past several weeks and is a practitioner, an attorney out of New York. So thank you for being a part of this conversation, and welcome to Houston virtually. So thank you for your time. So as aforementioned, Ramya is corporate counsel, works in-house for Bowery Farming, which is a New York-based startup that is revolutionizing the way food is grown by cultivating crops without soil, vertically and indoors. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. She started this role in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic because she is passionate about access to food and combating climate change through innovation. Before this, she spent many years in the New York office of Skadden Arps, where she worked on regulatory enforcement, criminal defense, and immigration matters. She received a Bachelor of Science with honors at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where she was a Chancellor's Scholar, a Master's of Science from the University of Oxford, and where she also was a Clarendon Scholar and received a JD at Columbia Law School in New York. While she was a law student, she was editor-in-chief for the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law. Ramya has also worked for the Burmese nonprofit law firm Justice for All, as well as with the International Justice Program at Human Rights Watch and the Legal Aid Society of New York. And a fun fact, Ramya grew up around the world and spent 4th grade in 3 different countries, which is really cool. The most exciting thing that happened to me in the 4th grade was waiting for the new Backstreet Boys CD to come out. So being able to go to 3 different countries is much more exciting than waiting at Walmart for that CD. So thanks again, Ramya, again, and welcome to the HYLA community. To sort of start off the conversation this evening, I guess we'd like to learn a little bit about Bowery Farming, specifically your background of the company, your role there as in-house counsel, and to talk a bit about how the company has a unique approach to democratizing access to fresh food.
Yeah, thank you, first of all, Anyete, for inviting me. I'm so excited to participate and share what I can with this group. I gotta say, Zoom is particularly weird because it's often challenging to kind of hear people talk about you in front of you, all the more so when you can see yourself reacting to it on screen. So it's, I gotta get better at that. But thank you for the kind words. Yeah, I started at Bowery about 8 months ago now. In fact, 2 days after I gave my notice to Skadden, we all went into lockdown. So my expectation and understanding of what my role was going to be like had to be tweaked and adjusted rapidly because, I had this image of throwing off my suits and wearing sneakers to work and communal salads and working at our farms and what have you. And all of that was set aside. And I was, parking myself in my living room and kind of working out of a tiny laptop screen. So that was definitely an adjustment. But what I was really excited about, despite this change in work environment, was the mission that Bowery is trying to strive for. So my background, as Anyeti mentioned, is in environmental science, and I was hoping to bring my legal expertise to a crossroads where it could be married with my environmental science background. So Bowery was really attractive to me for that reason. So we're an indoor vertical farming company. So what that means is, instead of growing produce in the traditional way of, out in the fields where you've got people kind of harvesting and growing outdoors, subject to all the seasons, subject to all the perils and contaminants that the outdoors have, you end up actually growing produce indoors, and you're growing it vertically. So one on top of the other. And this way you're saving space, you're saving resources. You can plant your farms wherever you want. So it's close to cities where you're feeding people as well as growing food 24/7. So you don't have to worry about seasons, and you can kind of calibrate exactly what the plant needs and be able to monitor and control yields and harvests more effectively. So the technology aspect, which is obviously very cool and very interesting and groundbreaking, is only one part of the puzzle for Bowery. The other piece is the mission to democratize access to fresh food. So at Bowery, we're actually doing that in 3 discrete ways. The first is we partner with a wide range of retailers. So actually, in the time that I've been at Bowery, the last 8 months alone, we've grown substantially. So we're now in almost 700 stores in the greater New York area and in the mid-Atlantic region, because we have farms outside of New York City and New Jersey. We have farms in the greater Baltimore area. And from there, we're able to supply almost 700 stores. So the stores that you'll find us in higher end stores like specialty culinary spots. You'll find us in Whole Foods, but then you'll also find us on the other side of the tier of the consumer tier. We also are in Albertsons. We're in Weis Markets. We're in Walmart. So the price point at which people have access to our produce is quite broad. So we think that makes us a key differentiator from other sort of specialty producers who you might find only in, high-end restaurants, or you might find only in like premier grocery stores. So that's the first way we're democratizing the access. The second way that we're doing that is by aligning with nonprofit partners who are actually increasing access and education about healthy food. So one big partner in this space is the DC Central Kitchen, which is a nonprofit based out of DC. It's been around for a long time. And it's basically pioneered this idea of supplying healthy corner stores in the DC area. So we'll talk a little bit more about the role corner stores play in a lot of people's access to healthy food. But if you think about it, if it's in New York, we call them bodegas, or like a convenience store, like a 7-Eleven, fresh produce is not what comes to mind when you're thinking of the shelves there. So DC Central Kitchen has a program where it's going to these corner stores and supplying them with fresh produce. And we partner with them to supply DC Central Kitchen below market prices, our produce. And they then are able to provide that to people through these healthy corner store programs. We also separately have been donating thousands of pounds of produce. So I believe as of yesterday, in the year 2020 alone, our company has donated more than 65,000 pounds of fresh produce. And yeah, it's crazy. So that's been another big piece of the nonprofit contributions. And then the third way in which we're democratizing access to fresh food is through our skill-based volunteering. So that's very much a part of our company culture, where our employees are encouraged and welcome to provide expertise beyond just your average, like showing up and being an extra body in the food distribution channel, which of course is important. But if you are able to, for example, if you're someone who is really good with coding, we encourage you to set up a coding program so that the recipients who are coming for fresh food may also have the opportunity to build out their, coding skill set for that next job they're applying for. Or for me as a lawyer, one of the things that I'm looking to do is provide my legal expertise in a pro bono capacity for the recipients of the food donations. And it's a program that we're continuing to build out. That last piece is in its pilot phase. So we're hoping that, in subsequent iterations, we're able to have a better registry of special talents that our employees are bringing to the table that we can then match up with the needs of our communities where we're serving. So those are the three big prongs in the democratizing access mission that Bowery has.
Well, and thank you for breaking that down, because one thing that you had mentioned, in talking about the module or method, the way that Bowery Farming sort of puts together their farming, like through the sort of indoor vertical process, it made me curious as to, I guess, what are by implementing or incorporating that type of sort of innovative farming method, what is doing that, I guess, remedy that I guess traditional farming doesn't do? Like, how does that impact, like I think about maybe food that is traveling from a farm. Like, you see what I'm saying? I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, the status quo, it's obviously agriculture is one of the earliest industrial processes, or one of the earliest ways through which human innovation has expanded. But there are a lot of inefficiencies built into traditional agriculture. You brought up food traveling. That's a really good example. So if I, living on the East Coast, want a head of iceberg lettuce, and I go to the grocery store and I pick up, like a big ball of iceberg lettuce, and I go to the checkout, what will get scanned is a ball of lettuce that actually was grown in a farm somewhere in California, and then had to be harvested, shipped, travel thousands of miles, and then arrive on the shelves of the grocery store in New York. And because that's the journey of the food, you have two things happening. The first is the age of that lettuce by the time it gets to the shelf is obviously a lot older, because it was picked so long ago. It had, it went through all these stages in the supply chain and the distribution. The second thing that happens on the farmer side is, because that journey from Los Angeles or from the Salinas Valley is so long and so far away from the end consumer, they, in their planning, they realize that there's going to be a lot of food that's going to go to waste, that's going to not make it to New York in good enough shape to be sold. So by having indoor farms that are much closer to the cities that are being fed, you have fresher food that is faster delivered to the end consumer. The other piece is with traditional agriculture, because you have the elements that you have to account for, because you have potential contaminants you have to account for, disease, pests, what have you. There's a lot more chemical inputs, a lot more waste that could be an externality of the process, which we're taking out of the equation, because by growing indoors, we're able to monitor the exact conditions of our plants at all times, and we're able to give them exactly what they need in the form of like their bare, their like the brass tacks elements, whether it's like this plant needs more nitrogen or this plant needs less humidity, what have you. We can monitor and cater to the needs of specific plants, and then we don't have the need for pesticides, we don't have the need for fungicides, any asides of any kind. So those were the kinds of things that we were trying to solve for by moving indoors and increasing the output capability, because now you're not only indoors, by growing vertically one on top of the other, we're actually increasing the efficiency of our yield per square foot of land being dedicated to agriculture.
and generally minimizing yield loss that would have happened, by eliminating that transportation part of the process.
Yeah.
Is this something, because New York City, Houston, we're both big like metropolitan cities, and earlier this week we had the honor of speaking with a couple. I had shared with you, we've spoken with a couple of leaders in the sort of sustainable agricultural space here in Houston from Urban Harvest and Planet Forward. And, those, admittedly, the spaces where they grow their food, it's a little bit smaller. They kind of have smaller patches of farmland and designated parts of the city and contiguous areas around the city. But do you think this, sort of method of indoor vertical farming for cities like us that mirror each other in terms of diversity and socioeconomic diversity as well, with people who need access to food, is that something that you think other cities could model?
Yeah, I really do. I think that, this is what I'll say. For people for whom this is an introduction to indoor vertical farming, just as like a standalone point, almost anything can be grown indoors, and certainly vertically, as long as you have the time and energy and the resource inputs you want to put into it. Not everything makes sense to grow indoors, obviously, because you have to think about economics. You have to think about the viability of it, in traditional agriculture. So, I don't think indoor vertical farming is the only answer to feeding cities like Houston or New York, but it's certainly one way to increase access, and it's a particularly important way to increase access in those areas where traditional agriculture is much further away. And we can talk more about food deserts and things like that. But yeah, I think there is a lot of potential for other cities to take on indoor agricultural facilities like ours. And especially during the pandemic, there has really been an appetite and a boom in investment in this space, where agricultural technology and innovation has been top of mind for several financial firms and venture-backed firms and things like that. So I think this is only growing. And again, I feel very fortunate to have made the change into the space when I have, because even in the time that I've been here, the landscape has shifted dramatically. And we're kind of keeping track of all the updates on a hour by hour basis sometimes.
Thanks for that, Ramya. That's actually a great segue into sort of a broader discussion about universality of access to food. And we actually had a great audience question on this to kind of kickstart this off before we delve deeper in, which said, some communities haven't had access to affordable fresh produce in a while, which you had touched on a bit. Do these local communities need to be educated that they can afford this, and it's actually accessible now? So I guess, how do we educate local communities, in particular, I guess, the communities in New York, where you have this sort of this innovative way of producing food at big amounts? I guess, how do you go about communicating local communities that there's fresh food in the neighborhood, and this is how you can get access to it?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think education is definitely one piece of it, where we are able to bring communities together and have an understanding of what is and isn't possible with respect to nutrition options. But I think that's only one piece of it, because even if someone's educated about what is and isn't healthy, it might not necessarily be their reality based on where they're living, that healthy option is a realistic option. So I think we should level set with our terminology. So I talked about food deserts before. So there are several there are tons of food deserts in the United States. And when I say food deserts, these are communities that are generally in low income areas where they lack a grocery store or farmer's market or any other real option for healthy food, and usually have to travel more than a mile to go access healthy food. And the USDA estimates about 23 million people live in food deserts. So, so that's one kind of concept I want to make sure everyone understands. Separate and apart from food deserts, there are food swamps. So food swamps are communities, even if there are healthy food options in those communities, they're oversaturated with fast food and unhealthy options. So basically there's more unhealthy than there is healthy. So even if someone didn't have to walk a mile to the healthy place, maybe they've got like 3 fast food chains within 100 yards of them. So they'd rather end up getting food there than like walking 3/4 of a mile to the grocery store. And this is, this concept doesn't only include fast food restaurants. I'm not trying to vilify them by any means. It also is like, convenience stores or other areas where fresh produce is harder to find. And then the third concept is a food mirage. And I think this kind of hits on the audience question. A food mirage is a barrier for individuals to access healthy foods. So even if there are healthy foods in their neighborhoods or in their communities, it is actually cheaper for them to go with the unhealthy option. So the way things are priced, the way things are incentivized, it's more likely that someone who can afford it will go to the healthy option, but those who can't will not. They'll end up going to the unhealthy option. So understanding the makeup of our local communities and figuring out where the food deserts are, the swamps are, and where there's that overlay of this mirage, that can help us target education efforts, that can help us target policy measures to better empower our citizens and our community members to then be able to make the choices that are best for them. And then since we're talking about concepts and, as a lawyer, I like definitions and like laying the groundwork. The other concept that I would bring up here is this concept of food equity, because that I think is our normative goal that we're working towards. But basically, at a bare minimum, food equity is a concept that believes access to healthy food is a human right. So by way of right, everyone should have access to good, nutritious food. And there are some proponents who go even further and they talk about individuals' empowerment to not just have access to healthy food, but to grow it, or, to be able to grow culturally significant healthy food. You can kind of dissect it into many more pieces, but at the bare minimum, it's that healthy food is something that, you don't have to make a choice on based on your income strata.
Thanks, Ramya. I actually have, in continuing the sort of terminology, differentiation discussion, I have a few other terms that I was hoping you could explain. But we had a follow-up question from Jay. Great questions, Jay. Is closing the gap between food deserts, swamps, and mirages an economic issue or an education issue?
I think it's both, to be honest. It's studies have shown educating people alone doesn't solve the problem, because even if someone's super educated that they live in a food swamp, if they don't have the economic mobility to then either move out of the food swamp or, afford to travel more than a mile on a consistent basis to have access to that healthy food elsewhere, they're still going to be stuck in that situation. So I really think it's a multi-stakeholder approach that we need to take for this. And I'm happy to kind of go into more granularity about the kind of policy proposals and the considerations we might want to think about, especially as lawyers and as advocates, if that's helpful.
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, I wish we had so much more time with you, because I have so many questions, and the audience does too, because there is a lot of granularity to these topics. And when you talk about food deserts, food swamps, et cetera, and having these, pockets of communities that lack this, the equitable access to have food that's nourishing and nutritious. It made me think about, just on a foundational level, to see if you could talk to us a little bit about the difference between food access, food insecurity, and food quality, because I think the three of those have to operate symbiotically. It's one thing to able to get to a place where there's food, but if the quality of food is low, then how is that helping you? So what sort of generally should our understanding be of those three terms?
Yeah, I mean, I think food equity, the way I think of it, kind of captures that balance really well, because
Yes.
it really is about access, but not just access to any food. It's nutritious food, right? And that's where the food quality piece comes into it. And for me, I think the pandemic more than ever has sort of really clearly put on display that difference between food access, food insecurity, and food quality. Because, for food access, you're talking about people who, if you see a long line waiting to go into a food pantry to get food, you can see the same. If you're seeing the same people over and over again, that's food insecurity to me, because they don't have a sustainable way to be able to nourish themselves without help. So that's one piece of it. Food access, if they had to travel, many miles to then stand in line at that pantry, that's a food access issue. And then different pantries might have different kinds of food. It might be, a combination of donations versus how they're sourcing versus, government programs or whatever. What are the people who are standing in that line walking out with? That kind of defines for me the food quality piece, because sometimes for example, if you look at during the Great Depression in the 30s, when people stood in food lines, the kind of food that they got out of it were like potatoes, flour, like packaged pork, things like that. And for some people, that might be enough to sustain themselves, but for the most part, it's not the most nutritious set of items. And then, like layer on top of that, the fact that it's not necessarily the most easy to adapt for different cultures who might experience food scarcity or hunger. So that's how I kind of think of food quality. So when it comes to these like pantries and donation centers, it's great that it's trying to solve for food insecurity, but if we're not keeping an eye out for who are the people who keep coming and why are they still coming, and what are the foods we're giving them, and how are they able to sustain themselves, how long can they go between visits sustaining themselves, if we're not asking those questions, the assessment of just looking at people waiting in line and saying, oh, we have a problem, is just missing the mark a little bit for me.
Right, agreed. And when you're talking about places like food deserts, or looking at food pantries in downtown, and looking at the makeup of the people in line and the makeup of these neighborhoods where that are in food deserts, I can't help but think of sort of how race is a metric in a lot of ways that food insecurity is evaluated. And I think this year in particular, everyone has sort of a heightened sense of awareness of racial inequities happening in a variety of spaces, but certainly, access to food and food insecurity and food accessibility is a huge part of that. And I was just curious as to your thoughts of how race, certainly, socioeconomic metrics play a role in evaluating this problem, and we're looking at this problem.
Yeah, I think it's, this big elephant in the room. I'm glad we're kind of talking about it, because if you look at the landscape of food insecurity nationally, Black and Hispanic households are nearly twice as likely to be struggling with food, and roughly 3 times as likely to report that their children are not eating enough. And if you look at these food deserts, if you look at maps of food deserts or food swamps, many of them overlay almost, border for border with communities of color and low-income communities. So the issue of food insecurity is very much an intersectional one, and it intersects with not just race and class, but with disability, with environmental policies. There's so many areas, social areas and socio-political areas that impact people's access to nutrition. So race is the most visible one by far. And actually, in some ways, I found it particularly interesting because even when the United States as a whole has sort of ebbed and flowed with respect to its access to food, Black and Latinx communities have always been disproportionately much lower in the demographics that have had access to food. So even if the entire country was doing really well or doing really poorly, Black and Latinx communities were always doing much worse than that norm. So that has never really changed over time. And the reason I think that is because food insecurity is tied up with so many issues that disproportionately impact communities of color, Black communities, Latinx communities, because food insecurity is a function of poverty. It's a function of incarceration. It's a function of environmental racism. So without, and that's another reason why I think we need a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder approach towards solving hunger, because we can't just sort of throw money at it and think it's going to go away, right? You need to kind of address these systemic issues that also contribute to certain communities that are continually entrenched in a cycle of being unable to build wealth, unable to access food, unable to have a dignified life. Going back to that concept of food equity, they're unable to have the fundamental human right of nutritious food.
And, the pandemic, as you brought up before, it certainly has exacerbated those economic and social divisions, and certainly has disparately impacted people of color, the disabled, the elderly, and isolated. So, hunger relief needs have been amplified due to COVID-19. And before we jump into the Feed Act, I did have a question about your opinion as to how the pandemic is impacting those who provide food. So we have this pandemic, and I'm wondering what sort of economic implications it's had on like food supply chains, like those in the agribusiness, farmers. What's sort of your assessment on the pandemic's impact on those who are trying to feed us?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of 3 buckets that I would put in front of us to think about how the pandemic has exacerbated hunger. So the first bucket or first category, like you were saying, I think is the food supply chain. So when I say supply chain, I'm talking about how food is grown and produced, stored, and then distributed. And the status quo pre-pandemic was a very fragile supply chain. It expected that, X would be grown, then shipped, that it would become Y, someone will process it, and then shipped, and then shows up at the grocery store as Z, right? Like, let's say that's your 3-pronged supply chain. If Y doesn't get X on time because of some sort of shock to the system, such as a pandemic, Z doesn't get created and doesn't get made, right? So it was relying on sort of the seamless journey, XYZ, all the time. And this hyper optimization for efficiency to get the consumer at the end that exact thing that they're looking for meant that there aren't enough safeguards that were built into place for a big, supply chain shock like the pandemic. So the supply chain wasn't able to handle the stress of thousands of consumers rushing to the grocery store, wiping clean all the canned goods and all the beans and all the cuts of meat and what have you. And for that same reason, you were seeing, these snaking lines in outside grocery stores, but that's also the same reason you were seeing tons of farmers, destroying crops or like dumping gallons of milk that they weren't able to sell. There's been a fundamental disconnect in the way the food supply chain operates. And because of the pandemic, it has totally blown open this fragility and has shown us that the way we think about how food is produced, planned for, distributed, managed, stored, and then ultimately consumed isn't working. We need a better system that kind of looks at what the true needs are, where we can warehouse efficiently, and where we can grow in a way that allows for those who need that product to get it most efficiently or most easily. The second area where I think the pandemic has kind of affected the food access issue is just our change in our personal routine, right? So before the pandemic, where did we all go to consume food? We went to restaurants, we went to cafeterias, people went to offices, they had access to vending machines. I think in 2019, bars, food trucks, and dining outlets were accounting for 47% of household food budgets in cities with populations of above 2.5 million. So in cities like Houston and New York, almost half of household budgets were spent, or household food budgets were spent in restaurants and outdoor facilities. We now don't do that, at least not in the same way. And then you also have to think about the closure of schools, right? Like the change in personal routine has meant children are not being sent to a place where they otherwise would have access to school lunches, breakfast, what have you. And it's funny because I was like getting ready for this talk, and when you and I and Yade had talked about maybe having this conversation, it was a little earlier in the season. It was in this, late summer, early fall. And I thought like schools are reopening, maybe this will be less of an issue. But obviously with COVID spiking up, and certainly in New York, the biggest public school system in the country, we've shut down again. That's again, millions of children that are now being pulled away from access to school lunch programs or school meal programs. So this change in our social practice has meant that areas and avenues through which people were nourishing themselves are not available in the same way. And of course, you're seeing like restaurants closing, you're seeing businesses closing, and this has only exacerbated everything. And then the third area where the pandemic, I think, has really shown itself to impact people's access to food is the larger scale economic impact. So people losing their jobs, non-food and food businesses closing, and what this has meant for people's ability to have income that can be spent on food. So instead of being able to pay for, your groceries, that person is now relying on food pantries and food banks to sustain themselves and their families. So I mean, all three buckets, I think, are discrete, but also very much interrelated. And as policy measures are being considered, just like with the conversation we were having earlier, I think we can't think of any one of these buckets as solvable on its own. We really need to think about the other two as well.
Yes, thanks, Ramya. And to your point about policy measures and sort of broader infrastructural changes that could be implemented to help remedy this problem, rather than, as you say, just throwing food at the problem, throwing money at the problem, implementing a public policy change. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the FEED Act. There are a lot of public policies and bills that, well, maybe not enough, but some that have been proposed to effectuate change. And I was wondering if you could talk about this newly proposed bill, which has sort of the unique multi-pronged process to address food security, but to talk about the FEED Act generally, and its sort of unique approach to expanding the understanding of what an emergency is and how we see an emergency.
Yeah, I'm smiling because I know the title of our conversation is the Feed Act. And maybe people were like, let's talk about the Feed Act. And we've got like the whole time not
There's
talking about
just so many things to lead up to it. Yes,
Yeah,
no
so for those of
problem.
you who were waiting, we're finally there. So a bit of background on the Feed Act. This was a proposed piece of legislation that was introduced in Congress in May of 2020. So it was introduced actually in both houses, or in both chambers. It was introduced in the House and in the Senate. And in both chambers has had bipartisan support, with Republicans and Democrats, supporting the bill. And the House bill actually was approved as part of the HEROES Act, which was a bigger picture, relief act that was in the House to solve for the coronavirus pandemic. It has continued though. So the House bill was approved and is in front of the Senate, and the Senate bill still hasn't moved from committee. But what the bill essentially is trying to do is, and what I'm most excited about with it, is this sort of multi-pronged, multi-stakeholder approach to solving for hunger. So the bill authorizes FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to approve state and local budgets and plans to partner with small restaurants and nonprofits to then use their infrastructure to provide nutritious meals to the local communities where they operate. So what that basically means is, the coronavirus pandemic has shut down like 100 restaurants in New York City, but here are 100 restaurants where there are industrial sized kitchens that are not being used, with scores and hundreds of staff who are underworked or out of work. Why not use the infrastructure of those kitchens and that workforce to then prepare meals that can then be used to feed people who are affected by the pandemic? So I thought that was like a really innovative way to address both the fact that tons of restaurants were buckling under the pressure of the pandemic and we're about to close. It was a novel way of hiring and employing restaurant workers who otherwise are not serving patrons and are not going out on deliveries in the same frequency. And it was a way to create healthy food that's not just a can of beans or what have you, to then distribute to communities. And the second piece of it, which you were asking me about, that is novel about this bill, is that by having FEMA be the agency that is partnering with local governments, we're actually expanding the resources in the war chest by which we are addressing the pandemic. Because when you think of FEMA, you think of like hurricanes, you think of like forest fires, you think of sort of these physical, visible emergencies. And by including something as invisible as a pandemic or hunger created by a pandemic within that definition of what would be an emergency worth triggering FEMA powers, we could then actually have federal coffers targeting localized areas and solving for hunger. So I thought that was a very novel and creative way by which we would be able to address this. And because it had bipartisan and bicameral support for so long, again, this was introduced back in May 2020. I thought by now we would have some movement, but because it has sort of languished in the Senate, we really, the urgency is greater now than it ever has been, because we're 8-9 months into this pandemic without any sort of light at the end of the tunnel for those who have been impacted, impacted more so by the pandemic with respect to hunger.
Thank you, Ramya, for explaining that, because I think, in your defense, it was important to contextualize everything, and to understand how all that could work within the Feed Act if it ends up getting passed. And, we just had an election. It'll be interesting to see, or still pending, I think, in a few Senate seats. So depending on, how things go, that could impact, where this bill ends up. And so thanks for introducing that to us, because I think it's important that we know what's going on within the legislative space. I just had a few more questions, and we had a few audience questions too. But what could you tell us about, I guess, the larger network of agencies, in the country on the legal side and the administrative side, that dictate how hunger relief needs are governed? We have this bill that's sort of sitting, waiting to see what happens next, but what can you tell us broadly about, sort of other institutions that seek to address this problem and govern this issue?
Yeah. So the first agency that comes to mind is obviously the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which dictates a lot of the hunger programming and research and policy approaches. But I mean, I feel like a broken record now, but I think it's really more than just that. It's an interdisciplinary approach. I think that there are hunger and food policy measures that could be implemented, not just by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but also Health and Human Services, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Labor, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Education. And I think the incoming Biden administration has kind of taken that interdisciplinary approach with respect to climate change, for example, where various agencies would be tasked with climate change addressing measures and regulations. And I think hunger could be approached in that exact same way, where you've got discrete goals that each agency is trying to achieve that would then reduce the population's dependence on public benefits and things like that, because they now can grow their own food, or they have a more robust, healthy food landscape in their community, or their education system allows them to feel more empowered and equipped with making better choices. And I mean, there's probably many other agencies too, where you can see food policy agenda items fitting in, but those are the big ones that I think kind of could have immediate and long-term and large impact, coming right out the gate as the transition happens.
And I think that's one thing, with this week-long program that HYLA is hoping to, really emphasize and that stays with everyone watching and who participates in our various programs is there's intersectionality to all of these, issues. It's nonprofit work, it's the public benefit space, all of that work, those sort of paths and programs work together on this matter. So thank you for emphasizing that as well. And as we move towards the end of this presentation, we do have a number of attorneys watching. We have law students watching too. And although there's a wide spectrum of work all of us can do volunteer-wise in the nonprofit space and other spaces. We had a great nonprofit panel on Tuesday. I think folks might be curious as to what advice you could give as to what we can do in our profession as legal practitioners, especially with some of these bills floating in the air, to support these communities who struggle with food access and food security.
Yeah, I think as lawyers, we are in a very privileged role where we're advocates and we are leaders in our communities. And I think we should use that platform. So, HYLA or other bar associations that you might be a part of could author position papers or make a statement about what local policies or even federal policies ought to be implemented to address food insecurity. And then, I think actually a really concrete one for Texas is, and we haven't even talked about this because obviously, as you say, there's so much we could talk about. We haven't talked about, supplemental nutrition assistance programs, right? SNAP benefits or food stamps as they've been called. As I understand it in Texas, there are very strict work requirements in order to be eligible for SNAP benefits. And I think a really concrete measure Houston lawyers could take is to advocate with state lawmakers to expand the requirements or be more lenient with the requirements so that you don't have to meet those strict definitions of having XYZ job or what have you in order to be eligible for the benefits. So that's one concrete action that you could advocate on. But other than that, because it's such an intersectional issue, alleviating poverty through our pro bono efforts is a really great way to alleviate hunger. So if you're helping with Social Security applications or Medicare applications, or dealing with benefit denials, if you're a litigator, I think that that's a, or even if you're not actually, you want to go into court, that would be a great way to help indigent clients with their socioeconomic health, which then translates obviously to food health. And as I understand it, you all have a session tomorrow that kind of goes into the nitty gritty of how to work on these kinds of applications.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, it's a couple hours of your time, you just helping a client fill out their SNAP benefits, and then they're off to the races, and then they can go into a grocery store. They don't have to suffer the, perceived indignity of waiting in line somewhere. They're able to use their SNAP cards or their EBT cards to purchase food and go home and be able to have control and agency over their nutrition in a way that I think everyone ought to. That can change someone, right? So helping with applications like that as lawyers, I think would create huge impact in the fight against food scarcity and food access.
Yes, agreed. Thanks, Ramya. That's like a great foundation laid to sort of plug what we'll be doing tomorrow, which is, at noon, we'll be doing a CLE on food stamp denial cases, exactly that, and what the appeals procedure is like. We have a presentation from Lone Star Legal Aid on that. So yeah, I think you're right. It's utilizing our privilege to be able to help our neighbors, and that's a huge part of it, is food assistance and eligibility programs help. So so thanks for that layup for that. We did want to leave just a few minutes for questions. I have a question that was sent in, and everyone's welcome to put anything in the queue or in the chat box. Bowery provides one-of-a-kind nutrition by way of producing vegetables. Do you see a role for Bowery to partner with providers of carbs and protein to accomplish a full plate for consumers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, we do some work like that right now. So some of our community partners are food kitchens, right? Like or pantries, where Bowery's produce is one part of a bigger meal that is being assembled and then distributed. And I certainly think the potential is there for us to continue to expand upon that. And I'm hoping that it's not just it's not just in the context of Bowery, but agricultural providers and produce growers on the whole can do that, where we're able to kind of come together and provide a well-balanced meal for those who need it.
Awesome, thank you. Good question. We did get a question emailed actually that says, what is the Ramya's opinion as to how plant-based diets such as veganism and vegetarianism can be seen as a solution to global food shortage or global food security?
Yeah, I mean, adopting a plant-based diet certainly helps with the climate change portion of, or the climate change piece of our discussion about food insecurity. But I don't think it's the only solution, and certainly not a realistic solution, because I think, culturally at a very bare minimum, there's different cultures that kind of value animal products or certain, animal dishes. So I wouldn't be able to, sit well with myself thinking like plant-based above all else. There are other, considerations in how people nourish themselves. The other thing is, there's actually just an article recently in the New York Times coming out of New Zealand, and how the Maori community there, the indigenous Maori community there, are feeding themselves during the pandemic. And the way they're dealing with food waste specifically is they're actually taking like animal, like the they were talking about fish. So instead of taking just the fillets, which usually go on sale in the market, they're taking the whole fish and they're distributing them. So now you're responsible for eating the fish head, the fish eyes, the parts that might be considered unappetizing. And by virtue of doing it that way, they've substantially reduced food waste. So I think plant-based diets can be one part of it, but another way to reduce food waste and to increase access to food might be to be more efficient with the way we think about butchery, the way we think about animal husbandry, so that, you know, it's not just 10 or 20% of the animal that ends up in front of someone to eat. It's, you know, you're able to fully, from what is it, like tip to tail, I think is the phrase.
Yes.
Be able to distribute the meat.
And that's a good point, because certainly for me, culturally, and how I grew up, I mean, we consumed everything, and you know, as far as, you know, beef and pork and certain parts of those animals that, you know, maybe for other communities it might be a bit insensitive or a bit uncomfortable to consume, but there are cultural sensitivities. I mean, there's a huge culture is a big part of food consumption and deciding what we eat. So I think that was a great question, but I agree with you that there are other metrics that have to be looked at when deciding to adapt a lifestyle like that. And even if you have the privilege to adapt a lifestyle like that, not everyone can afford almond milk or, you know, egg substitutes. You know, I think we all want to be aware of how, you know, what we eat, how it impacts our world. But food privilege is certainly a big part of the conversation. So thank you for that.
I'll say one other thing, actually.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I read Jonathan Safran Foer's Eating Animals, which was a book about not just the act of eating animals, but us as animals who eat. So it's very much about how storytelling plays a role in the act of eating.
Yes.
And he talked about how he was raising his child to be vegetarian, but his grandmother, who had survived the Holocaust, only knew how to make chicken, carrots, and peas. And he had this weight on him of depriving his son from being able to experience and being connected to his grandmother through food, because you know, his son was only vegetarian. So, you know, I think that's such a poignant image and such a poignant message around how our food choices can be beyond just ourselves. There's so many implications to them. For me, it's all about you know, having the privilege and the opportunity to make the choice instead of having that choice made for us.
Yes, thank you, Ramya. I agree with that too. What was the name of that book?
It's called Eating Animals.
Okay, yes, fantastic. Oh my gosh, Ramya, I really wish we had more time. I need to let all of y'all get back to your evening, and you especially, because you're on East Coast time right now. So I can't thank you enough for your voice and the work that you do, and for just giving us just a snapshot of the work that can be done, that needs to be done, and, you know, the larger issues that are impacting our neighbors in our country. So thank you so much, truly.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone. And, you know, hunger is one of those things that's always been an issue, but it's just become such a visible and obvious issue at the front of everyone's minds because of the pandemic. So I really appreciate all the enthusiasm and participation to talk about this and to try and brainstorm how to solve for it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. And what I'll let all of y'all know is I'll get this emailed out to you too, but we were approved for CLE credit. This great talk that Ramya gave us has been approved. So the course number is 1746 4098790. And I will get this email to you. We also just got a question about getting recording of this presentation. And yes, we'll have it posted to HYLA's YouTube page after we've had a chance to edit it and put it together for y'all. So we'll let y'all know about that, and I can get that email to all of you as well. So again, thanks to you all for watching. Thank you, Ramya, for your time. Happy Thanksgiving, or early happy Thanksgiving to you. And thank you all. Y'all stay safe and have a good weekend. Take care. Bye.